And I quote, Evelyn Zumaya spent years delving into formerly closed archives. The portrait that emerges of Valentino is, without a doubt, the most accurate and compelling that has so far been published. Too often, Hollywood finances are, well, boring, but money is the name of the game in Tinseltown, and Zumaya does a masterly job of unraveling the maze of greedy and dishonest players who try to gouge the estate for every penny to which they had no right. AffairsValentino is that rare Hollywood book that informs us of previously unknown facts yet tells a compelling narrative with terrific velocity. This is Hollywood as I know it, a glorious yet bitter moral landscape, end quote, by Robert Averick of the Seraphic Press. And I quote, Zumaya has faced viciously barbaric opposition to her work, which has compelled her to cease publication of this fine book. This is a disastrous pity, for she has done more than any other researcher to advance our understanding of this fascinating screen legend. If you find her book, buy it and don't flinch at the price. It tells a story worthy of any Hollywood scandal, end quote, by Tony Bond, publisher of the American Chronicle. The preceding excerpts, as cited from reviews, appear on the back cover of my Rudolph Valentino biography, which I titled AffairsValentino, a book first published in 2011. From the moment I announced my earliest AffairsValentino research discoveries several years prior to the book's publication, I came under withering attack online by a Valentino cult whose primary tenet has been their, quote, campaign to ruin Evelyn. I was recently informed they call it just that. In referring to these people as a cult, I use the definition of a cult as, and I quote, a system of veneration and devotion directed to a particular figure or object, end quote. In this case, the particular figure would be Rudolph Valentino. By the time I published AffairsValentino, their extreme and unrelenting cyberbullying attacks had destroyed any hope of salvation for my reputation and for my book's survival. The threats levied against me online by these cultists were of such a grave nature that in the interest of my family's safety, I was forced to take the book out of print. I have since republished AffairsValentino in 2 subsequent editions, and thanks to Renato Flores. It would be a costly and nearly impossible effort to remove all the defamatory information they have posted about me online, so I ask people to recognize the signatures of those cultists who engage in this campaign to prevent people from reading my books and knowing the truth. It is in my continuing effort to refute this online defamation and defend my personal integrity, the integrity of my research process, and my Valentino discoveries that I announce today a new feature in our Rudolph Valentino podcast, Inside AffairsValentino. The format of these featured Inside AffairsValentino episodes will differ from that of our regular episodes, which we title Rudolph Valentino and More, with a customization of that title for each episode. In our Rudolph Valentino and More episodes, we discuss aspects of Valentino's life and times. In Inside AffairsValentino, I will instead be sharing stories on various topics which I first brought forth in AffairsValentino. I will reveal new information, analysis, and do my best to expand the historical knowledge about those subjects. Today, in this first Inside AffairsValentino episode, which I title I'm So Glad for You, Rudy, I address 2 topics mentioned in AffairsValentino which I feel merit further detail. Ms. Zunilda Mancini's lawsuit against Rudolph Valentino's close friend and trusted business manager, S. George Ullman, and the theft of 2 wicker baskets, or hampers, from George Ullman's garage. These baskets contained his paper trail and archival Rudolph Valentino business materials. Who was the thief who executed that daring break-and-enter into George Ullman's garage? Who was this thief? Who knew exactly what they were looking for? My first Inside AffairsValentino story today: who stole George Ullman's wicker baskets? For those of you who have not listened to our previous episodes, An overview as to how S. George Ullman found himself in the midst of this sordid tale. It all began at the time of Valentino's death in August of 1926, when he was appointed Valentino's estate executor. George Ullman writes in his 1975 memoir, and I quote, "I should have then realized that I would only have trouble and aggravation in handling the estate, and immediately turned everything over to the court to administer. But I was too idealistic." End quote. As Rudolph Valentino's executor, George Ullman faced a daunting task, as he would testify in court by saying, and I quote, "At the time of Mr. Valentino's death, I knew the exact condition of his affairs and his finances. So far as he was concerned, as far as the productions were concerned, I was the only one who did know." End quote. George Ullman would also write how he worked harder after Valentino's death than he ever did before. With his wife as assistant and his secretary, Clara Trask, George accomplished a monumental feat as executor and saved Valentino's estate from bankruptcy, promoted his film successfully, and turned debt into profit. Now, in the course of his Valentino work, a great paper trail was generated, and this is the material which he would store for posterity in those wicker baskets in his garage. As you, our knowledgeable listeners, know, things went about as tragically as they possibly could have for Executor George. This was due to several factors, one being a missing page of Valentino's will, which compromised his role as executor, and other factors were the greed and disruption generated by Valentino's brother Alberto and the silence of a critical witness, Valentino's handyman, Lou Mahoney. On that missing second page of Valentino's will, he instructed George to continue managing his production company, and he bequeathed his entire estate to his nephew Gene, who at the time of Valentino's death was still a minor. Because this document could not be found, Executor George would follow the vague terms expressed on the existing first page of the will. In doing so, he dispensed estate funds as cash to the three people apparently named as beneficiaries: Valentino's brother Alberto, his sister Maria, and his ex-wife Natasha Rambova's aunt Teresa Warner. The advances, which George made in good faith, totaled some $70,000, by today's currency. Now, a few years later, when a copy of that critical second page of Valentino's will surfaced to be admitted by the court as a legitimate portion of Valentino's will, George Ullman learned he'd advanced estate funds to three people who were not Valentino's heirs at all. Valentino stipulated they receive only weekly allowances from his estate. But by the time that second page of the will was found, Alberto Valentino, who had been living for years on George's generous advances from the estate, decided to sue George for mismanagement. George expressed shock at this litigation, reminding Alberto how when he inherited the estate as executor, it had almost no assets, and he had generated all of the monies to date. How, he asked, could this be interpreted as mismanagement? Yet the law was clear, and as executor, George Ullman was held responsible to repay the estate for all of the funds he advanced to Alberto and his sister, the very people who spent that money. The lower court ruled against Ullman despite the recovery of the second page of the will. Ullman filed an appeal of the lower court ruling with the California Appeals Court, which ruled in his favor by granting him a full exoneration. The appeals court judgment stated Ullman acted in good faith and recommended that the people who benefited from the money establish a fairness lien and settle the issue among themselves. George Ullman, the appeals court judge stated, should not be held responsible to return the money as he did not benefit from it. Alberto Valentino was furious to hear the lower court ruling had been overturned. He instead ignored the recommendation of the appeals court ruling and seized the legal twist of awful fate for Ullman as a way to actually have that money twice, once from his brother Rudolph's estate as disbursed to him by George Ullman, and a second time as collected from George Ullman. Despite this being a grossly unfair thing to do, to make someone pay you back for money they already gave you in good faith plus interest, Alberto pursued George Ullman in legal collection processes for the next 30 years, trying as he sought to collect the money he spent years prior. He did so while misrepresenting the very nature of those funds Ullman owed. He led the public to believe Ullman was charged with embezzlement, and that those funds he owed the Valentino estate were illegal disbursements. It was never shared by Alberto or his family that those disbursements were made to them. Maintaining this false narrative would require the removal of evidence, which might let the world know the truth, that Ullman was not the villain of the story, as they so claimed. An irrelevatory paper trail was deemed critical to remove in order to perpetuate their fiction about the nature of the money Ullman owed the estate. Needless to say, there was consequently no small amount of bad blood between George Ullman and Alberto Valentino. In 2003, I located George Ullman's 2 surviving children, his son Bob and daughter Bunny. They contributed in great measure to the development and writing of this story. They granted me exclusive access to their father's materials and the licensing rights to his 1975 memoir, which at that time had never been shared publicly. In the course of my vetting this wealth of material, I would discover much more about the paper trail cover-up of George Ullman's truth. I would discover, incredibly, that the entire probate case file of Rudolph Valentino's records had been stolen from its rightful housing in the Los Angeles County Hall of Records. I would be successful in locating copies of that file and at last be able to prove the truth about Ullman's performance as executor. Now, even though Ullman's children knew surprisingly little about their father's business involvement with Rudolph Valentino, because it was a painful subject for him to discuss, and even though they were learning about this story as I uncovered it, they both knew all about those wicker hampers or baskets in the garage. They both remembered how their father would take a glass of bourbon on a Sunday afternoon and head out to the garage to spend some time alone with his old Valentino archive. He was attached to those baskets and his ritual of sorting through the papers of his Valentino business. Where else would these documents attesting to Valentino's business be housed but in the archive of his manager? Now, I have mentioned Valentino memorabilia collector Bill Self many times in past episodes, and in AffairsValentino I refer to him as Bill Pelf. I did so to protect his name from appearing in an internet search. Bill Self was a critical source for AffairsValentino, as he not only collected all things Valentino, he befriended everyone who was involved with Valentino who was still alive when he came to Hollywood in the late 1940s, including Robert Florey, Gene Acker, Alberto and Jean Valentino, and yes, George Ullman. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, every year on collector Bill Self's birthday, George Ullman would select something from his wicker baskets to gift to his good friend Bill. He would arrive to wish him a happy birthday, and they would share an annual toast to Bill, who was thrilled to receive such gifts as Valentino's United Artists contract, address books, and correspondence. These gifts from Ullman presented problems, though, for Bill Self, because he was also friendly with Alberto and Jean Valentino. They would notice some new piece from George Ullman's archive and tell Self it rightfully belonged to them as Valentino's family. Alberto bristled at the news that Ullman had anything that had a thing to do with his brother, as he felt it all belonged to them. Now, Alberto seemed to have forgotten that possession is not only 9/10 of the law, but those papers were a part of Ullman's legitimate business history. Alberto nevertheless sensed the materials increasing in value and told Self, as Self told me, that he could keep the items until he kicked the bucket. So Self said nothing to George about the complications with Alberto and looked forward to Ullman showing up year after year, until George claimed he told Self he would, and I quote, soon have nothing left to give him. Did George tell his buddy Bill Self about the rest of his Rudolph Valentino business archive being stored in his wicker baskets in his garage? Oh, I think he sure did. And the reason Bob and Bunny Ullman knew about those wicker baskets? They were there the day their father went out to his garage, and they watched him stand in shock as they all realized both baskets with the entire Valentino archive had been stolen. Ullman's children told me how their father was devastated. It was another miserable turn of events on top of years of miserable turns of events for him, and all of his Rudy materials had disappeared. Bob and Bunny Ullman told me those baskets contained papers and business documents, such as the contract granting Ullman power of attorney for Rudolph Valentino, of which they were proud to still have a copy. Now, the story of the wicker basket theft would gain importance for me recently in the following way. It was in 2003 when I began interviewing Bill Self. I would interview him many times over a period of about 1 year. I would fly down to Burbank from San Francisco, where I lived at the time, rent a car at the Bob Hope Airport in Burbank, and drive down the 405 freeway to Bel Air and Beverly Hills to visit with Mr. Self for a few hours. I always timed my visits so I could sit for a while in a Starbucks in Westwood, a few minutes' drive from his home, where I would go over my notes for the interview. I will say I was always greeted cordially and treated with the utmost respect by Mr. Self and his wife. His wife would tell me she was happy I came to see her husband because he had no one else to talk with about Valentino. After each interview, I drove a few blocks down the hill from Self's home and parked along the street. I then wrote absolutely everything I needed to remember. Self grew nervous if I wrote too much as we talked, and it did not take much to have him become reticent. He adamantly refused to let me record his interviews. So I scrawled all my notes while sitting in my rental car on Samaro Road, and as soon as possible, before I could forget a single thing. Sometimes as I was waiting at the gate for my flight back to San Francisco, I would still be writing thoughts and details from a meeting. Now, on what would turn out to be my last visit with Bill Self, I entered his home to find him uncharacteristically nervous from the moment I arrived. Our previous interviews all took place in his den, where he would make a cocktail for me at his bar. On that last visit, I was not escorted into his den, but into a side sort of ante-living room. We sat next to each other awkwardly on a blue formal sofa, where he told me with the seriousness of someone about to deliver very bad news that Janine Villalobos told him he was not to speak to me again. He said she wanted, quote, an exclusive arrangement with him. Well, what could I say? I made some comment about how sorry I was to hear that, but he'd already clammed up. It was obvious he was not about to disobey Ms. Villalobos. I began to organize my things to leave as he remained seated on that stiff little sofa looking upset. As I stood and said my goodbye, wondering why he let me come so far just to hear that, he rose and turned to say to me quite out of the blue, quote, you know I had nothing to do with the theft of those wicker baskets from Ullman's garage. To say I was taken aback would be an understatement, as Bill Self and I had never discussed those baskets. I replied, you mean the baskets where Ullman kept his Valentino materials? Yes, Self answered. I surmised immediately this was something he planned to confess before I left forever, and something in his backhanded way he needed to get off his chest. But because of Janine Villalobos' executive order, Bill Self's time was up to talk to me about such things. After Self's death in November of 2010, his daughter began auctioning off his collection. There, among his Rudolph Valentino relics of great value, were those Valentino papers, many, many documents, including that contract granting Ullman Valentino's power of attorney, which was purchased by Tracy Ryan Terhune on December 1st, 2016 for $2,588.75. I allege these documents were from George Ullman's archival materials, which were stolen from his garage. I also add emphatically that as a researcher, I truly lament that all of this valuable material is not housed in a reputable film library and made available to researchers, biographers, and the public in general. It is ironic to me that today one of the people most vociferous in the perpetuation of the false narrative about Ullman, Tracy Ryan Terhune, would dare to criticize George Ullman for preserving the very items he now owns as treasures. I also find it the height of hypocrisy to impugn Ullman for his safeguarding for decades and for placing sentimental value on the content of those baskets. And it is the height of hypocrisy to throw the tiniest stone at Ullman when, as I mentioned, these materials were no doubt stolen from his garage. Who else would even have those documents? When Valentino died, those papers had zero value as a commodity, as people were buying furniture, clothes, animals, and cars, and not a manager's paper trail of documents. I have learned in my research that stolen archives seem to be a pastime in the world of collectors, and as I have said in previous episodes, this has been a valuable contributing factor to the Valentino family and their ability over the years to control a false narrative about many aspects of Rudolph Valentino's life. This is especially true concerning George Ullman. I have to thank that thief who stole the lower court records, because if they had not been missing, I would probably never have found the appeals court records exonerating George Ullman. Now, this would be the story of just another shady collector's deal and the theft of some musty documents kept in a garage, but this is not the case. The spoils of that theft of Ullman's archive were exploited to rewrite his history, to control a false narrative, and one in which Ullman is erroneously portrayed as a villain, when in fact, according to all those documents I discovered, he is proven to be the hero. My second story for today I title Ms. Mancini, also known as the Aged Lady, her Valentino ring, her Valentino tie pin, and other charitable Valentino donations recalled. One of George Ullman's first acts as Rudolph Valentino's executor was to write a letter to every person who had requested a photo of the star or who wrote him a credible letter during the previous year. In this letter, George requested they form Valentino memorial guilds in their own cities and towns, appointing him honorary head of the local guild. The purpose of these guilds was to not only keep Valentino's legacy alive, but to pressure local theaters to show his movies. In this way, the future of Valentino's popularity and continued financial success was organized and nurtured across America. It was an ambitious move on Ullman's behalf and a successful grassroots effort which I consider ingenious. Some of these Valentino guilds were more active than others, and the Rudolph Valentino Memorial Guild Incorporated of Hollywood would become one of the most powerful. It was this guild which would organize the permanent memorial to Valentino, a statue installed in Hollywood's DeLongre Park. Throughout 1927, 1928, and 1929, the permanent memorial to Valentino became the focus of the Hollywood Memorial Guild's attention, with a part of this effort being devoted to the raising of funds necessary to commission a statue befitting Valentino's memory. Their fundraising campaign received press as well as donations. By the end of 1929, the final commission was granted to noted sculptor Roger Noble Burnham. By January of 1930, Roger Noble Burnham had just completed another high-profile commission, a statue commemorating the 50th anniversary of the founding of the University of Southern California. He sculpted the 8-foot-tall Trojan warrior, which would become the school's iconic logo and known as Tommy Trojan, and he was reportedly paid $10,000 for his work. Now, although George Ullman was honorary head of the Rudolph Valentino Memorial Guild Incorporated of Hollywood, their activities were not the focus of his days during that time in his life. As I mentioned in the story of the stolen wicker baskets, he was embroiled in the legal actions brought against him by Valentino's brother Alberto. And until he voluntarily resigned as executor, he was still managing the business of the estate of Rudolph Valentino. So the plans being bandied about by the Hollywood Memorial Guild and Burnham's statue were not a top priority for Ullman. Burnham initially proposed a larger, realistic sculpture of Rudolph Valentino for DeLongpre Park, but the locals protested the plan. They demanded the statue not be a literal interpretation of Valentino and believed this would be an eyesore in their neighborhood. Burnham and the Hollywood Guild accommodated their directives, and the agreed-upon statue would be a stylized representation of a man poised in a solemn salute to the sky, generically nude and not so vaguely resembling an Oscar. The service for the unveiling of Burnham's statue, which he called Aspiration, took place on May 6, 1930, which would have been Valentino's 35th birthday. Some reports alleged 300 people attended the ceremony to see the bronze statue unveiled. Other accounts numbered the audience at over 1,000 people. Aspiration was dedicated by the actress Dolores Del Rio, with the press noting the lack of famous people from the motion picture industry in attendance. As my account of that event, I will read the coverage in the New Movie Magazine issue of July 1930. The title of this article reads, "Hollywood Unveils Its Memorial to Valentino," and I quote, "If Rudolph Valentino needed anything to make him immortal, anything to remind those who follow that he once lived and died, that something was given him upon that day, which would have been his 35th birthday, molded in imperishable bronze, plated with shining gold, a statue to his memory and honor was unveiled in DeLongpre Park, in Rudy's own Hollywood. The memorial cost over $10,000. It was paid for by humble and sincere offerings of nickels and dimes from thousands of his fans who sent their mites from 4 corners of the earth. It is called Aspiration. The statue thus named will be a perpetual symbol of his industry and his high ideals, which he endeavored to carry out during the days of his life," said Alberto Melini Ponce de Leon, vice consul in Los Angeles for the country which gave Rudolpho Valentino birth, Italy. 1,500 people bowed their heads and thought back to Rudy, thought perhaps of the beauty and romance he brought into the world through the medium of the silver screen. For several days before the unveiling, rain had wetted the park. The morning of the day dawned gray and bleak. Those who gathered at the statue did so under lowering and threatening clouds. It seemed as though the very heavens felt sad. Dolores Del Rio pulled the cord, which dropped the velvet wrap from around the memorial, and, call it a coincidence if you will, the clouds broke, and a shaft of pure sunshine struck the statue. It lit it up until it was a golden, radiant torch. Tiptoe, face uplifted, it stood straining as though to lift itself by the very power of thought and desire to a higher level and better things. George Ullman, who was Rudy's closest and best friend, stared straight ahead, tears streaming down his face. His lips moved. "I'm glad for you, Rudy," he said. "You will never be forgotten." Those who love the memory of Valentino can take further pride in the fact that this memorial to him is the only one to a motion picture actor in any public park in the United States. That at least shows what Los Angeles and Hollywood think of the departed boy who brought them so much credit during his life." End quote. Now, the price of Aspiration was reported to have been everywhere from $2,000 to $18,000. In fact, it cost $2,000. And the funds were raised from a donation received from an elderly woman, or an aged woman as she was referred to by the press, who lived in New York City, a Mrs. Zunilda Mancini. She was a widower and told the press that her husband had been an Italian, and because he was a gentleman, she assumed all Italian men were likewise. She also claimed she loved Rudolph Valentino, quote, "almost better than his son," end quote. This was her explanation for her donation of $6,900 to benefit the Hollywood Guild in their efforts to establish a permanent memorial to Valentino. Now, during the same year in which she made her donation to the Burnham statue, Ms. Mancini of 255 West 33rd Street, Manhattan, was suing her secretary, demanding the return of a ring and a tie pin once owned by Rudolph Valentino. Ms. Mancini alleged she purchased the two items at the star's estate auction. Her secretary refused to return the items, saying they were given to her by her employer, Ms. Mancini, in return for her professional services and her kindness extended. The ring was valued at $400 and the pin at $25, and Ms. Mancini said she never gave the items to her secretary. She won her case, and her secretary appealed the verdict. Perhaps the Rudolph Valentino Memorial Guild Incorporated of Hollywood should have heeded Ms. Mancini's past legal activity in reclaiming her charitable gifts to her secretary. For 3 years after the installation of Aspiration, Ms. Mancini learned Roger Burnham was paid $2,000 for the statue and assumed her donation was procured solely for the statue. She sued George Ullman as head of the guild for the $4,900 difference between the cost and her donation. 3 years had passed since the successful installation of Burnham's Aspiration, and George Ullman had not kept up with the guild bookkeeping. In fact, he had not kept the bookkeeping at all. He considered the subject closed, the statue in place, and was then struggling to run his own faltering talent agency business and survive Alberto Valentino's aggressive legal persecution. His wife was also gravely ill with tuberculosis and underwent several life-threatening surgeries. With 3 small children to care for, George Ullman's life at that time was demanding, and news he was being sued again certainly added to his duress. In her suit against Ullman, Ms. Mancini's lawyers portrayed her as an elderly widow who was left penniless by her donation, and she was down to her last dime. Despite this being of no relevance to her decision to donate that amount, she was, after all, paying lawyers to collect that money, lawyers which would no doubt cost her more than the $4,900 she was out to collect. They cried swindle and ran the ball all the way to victory. She won her case to recover Valentino's tie pin and ring, and she won her case against Ullman. Now, George Ullman was ordered to pay Zunilda Mancini the $4,900. He remained adamant that in reality he spent far more than her donation on the plans and the completion of the final statue, but that he simply had not kept the books proving this. He appealed this lower court decision and added this case to his appeals case of the charges levied against him by Alberto Valentino, hoping it would all be dismissed by the Court of Appeals. This would not be the case. With no proof as to the actual accounting of the expenses for Aspiration, George's appeal was refused, and he paid Miss Mancini the $4,900. Alberto Valentino weighed in on the subject in a furious letter he wrote to the Los Angeles Times. He was upset the paper reported Ms. Mancini believed an Italian organized the installation of Aspiration. He clarified it was George Ullman, and George Ullman was not an Italian. He proceeded to use his letter to the editor to trash Ullman by saying he was ordered to return funds to the Valentino estate. Alberto fails to mention in his impugning that $80,000 of this amount due was money he spent, which he received from Ullman as advances granted against his supposed inheritance from his brother's Rudolph's estate. Alberto implies Ullman was guilty of embezzlement and dishonesty when this was proven by the Court of Appeals to not be the case. Ms. Zunilda Mancini, in my opinion, needed to learn a thing or two about charity. And when you write a check in someone's memory, consider that your gift to the cause, with no strings attached. This would apply to a secretary who you gifted a ring and a tie pin once owned by Rudolph Valentino, or to a guild in Hollywood working to establish a memorial to Valentino. If George Ullman said he had lost the accounting and records of the Mancini donation, then I believe he did. 3 years had passed, and yes, he should have been more accountable. But in light of what he was doing and what he confronted both professionally and personally, I am not surprised this happened. He was watching his professional reputation disintegrate because of his loyalty to Rudolph Valentino. This after successfully creating Rudolph Valentino's legacy and generating a fortune for the Valentino estate so they could all reap the rewards. And in my opinion, they still are. George Ullman alone got that sad marketing train back on the tracks after Rudolph Valentino's death, and he profited mightily for the estate. In their zeal to impugn Ullman then and now, they appear to forget that. Bills were paid. All of the lifestyles maintained, and the post-mortem business of Rudolph Valentino was taken care of by the man he trusted most. And aspiration? It was vandalized many times, stolen and found, and in 1952 removed for 20 years to be kept in storage. It has a colorful history, which can be read about further online. When I went to DeLongpre Park to see this statue for the first time, I went with Michael Morris. As we took our pictures and chatted, we noticed a dubious character eyeing us, and we decided we had best head to the car. Indeed, this person began following us as we left, and by the time we neared the car down the street, they were almost chasing us. From that experience on, I was grateful for automatic car door openers because Michael had an older model car which did not have that feature, and he had to open the car doors with a key. It was a very close call. I might suggest to anyone planning on visiting DeLongpre Park to not go there alone or at night and be wary, because it is not such a great part of Los Angeles these days. Now, the script of each of these Inside Affairs Valentino episodes, which will include my sources, citation, and images, will be posted on my blogs on rudolphvalentino.org and on AffairsValentino.com. For further information, please refer to Affairs Valentino and the S. George Ullman memoir for the rest of the story. Now, in closing today, I want to say that I know Simon Constable is about to drop his most hateful possible screed about George Ullman, as he did about Frank Manillo. I hope he will think better and not do that. If he does, I think it will most probably reveal more about Simon Constable than about his subject. This certainly was the case with his piece on Frank Manillo. His snide, bullying motivation seeped through any attempt at feigned research. So I say to Simon Constable directly, young man, I consider you but a foot soldier in the campaign to ruin Evelyn, which has failed for a decade and counting, and which will continue to fail miserably. I remind you to find the light here because your reputation precedes you, and as hard as you try to find that one tiny anything to use to perpetuate the false narrative about George Ullman, portraying him as being some arch-villain, the real documentation tells the big picture, and George Ullman was proven in court to be the ultimate hero of Rudolph Valentino's story. So there you have it, and I am glad for you, Rudy.